Hi guys, so we'll pick up here with class 2. There'll be a couple of lectures here, one focusing on etiology and the other discussion of treatment. So this slide we've seen before when we were talking at the very beginning of the semester about genetics, and this was an example I gave you. So it may look familiar, but this is a chart showing the heritability between different pairs for schizophrenia. So, right, so if we take two random people in the general population, so two unrelated, unconnected people, we see a concordance rate of 1%, which means a heritability rate of 1%. And so this shows our concordance rates. And so when we come way down here, right, offspring of dual matings, meaning if both parents have schizophrenia, then their offspring have 46% chance of developing schizophrenia. Monozygotic twins, if one twin has schizophrenia, then there's a 48% chance that the other twin will, which is very different than dizygotic twins, right? Monozygotic are those identical twins, 100% shared genetics. Dizygotic or fraternal twins, only the same as shared genetics as typical siblings. 17% for dizygotic. You'll notice it's higher than typical siblings. Obviously, there's some environmental effect, and twins share more of their environment than siblings of different ages, right? So you can take a look at this, but the overall message here, right, if we look at those monozygotic twins or the offspring of two people with schizophrenia, is that we have about a 50-50 chance then of developing schizophrenia, which means that it's highly genetic, more genetic than anything else we've talked about to some extent. But not completely genetic, because if your identical twin has schizophrenia and you don't, it means something different happened for each of you other than your shared genetics. Right, and so this slide goes over those things again. But here's the thing, that the genetics of this is not that there's a gene for schizophrenia. Remember, we've talked a number of times now that genes inform your biology. So in this case, genes inform levels of neurotransmitters, how neurotransmitters are used by your brain, sensitivity of neurons to certain neurotransmitters, brain anatomy, brain physiology, right? So how the brain functions. That's what genes dictate. And then those biological things lead to behaviors and experiences that we label, if they're grouped together, as a disorder. But all of the genetic research we're going to look at briefly has one clear message, which is that there's no simple genetic explanation for schizophrenia. And this is it makes sense and it's important because schizophrenia, the widespread disruption of schizophrenia, so the disruptions to sensory experiences, the disruptions to beliefs, disruptions to the ability to act in logical ways or planful ways or task-focused ways, all of those symptoms we talked about represent a wide range of disruption. And not everyone with schizophrenia has the same disruptions, that there's different manifestations or presentations of schizophrenia, which means that in order to get widespread disruption, you often need multiple genetic disruptions to lead to that, or multiple atypical genetic outcomes to lead to widespread disruption. And the fact that there's variation in how schizophrenia presents also means that for some people, some things will be disrupted and not others, and that's going to lead to a different set of atypical genetics for one group of people with schizophrenia versus another group of people with schizophrenia. And so all of that is just important to think about. Here's a list, and I'm not going to read through the list of specific genetic research outcomes. So in other words, you take somebody who's done research on the genetics of schizophrenia, and each one of these represents a result. And the reason I give you this list is that I want you to pay attention to, first, what kinds of things seem to be going on, but also how long the list is. So that we have genes affecting dopamine, and what we're going to talk about is how important dopamine is, especially dopamine in two different brain areas to the onset of schizophrenia. That we have genes that affect a protein used throughout the brain that get disrupted. We have glutamate receptors that are disrupted. We have something called COMT, which is really important in executive functioning. So decision-making, planning, judgment, those kinds of things. That that has disruption, or has had at least one study to show it has disruption. You might remember talking about copy number variations, which is when the gamete is being formed, that we see mutations there where there's too few numbers of certain genes that happen. We also, if you might remember, talking about single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, way back at the beginning of the semester. And there's research studies, if we look at them all together, that point to 10,000 different disruptions to SNP that might occur in people with schizophrenia. So there's not any one of these that is necessary for schizophrenia to happen, nor are there any of these which must be disrupted in order for schizophrenia to happen. These are some of the things that if we look at people with schizophrenia and we look at people without schizophrenia, some of the different genetic differences that we see. And so again, the message is wide variety of genetic disruption that might be important to the presentation of schizophrenia. So we mentioned before the idea of dopamine. Dopamine becomes important in schizophrenia as it's used in two very specific brain areas. So the first is the mesolimbic system, right? So that is about raw emotion. And we seem to see an excess of dopamine receptors. Now, this is an important distinction because we used to think it was too much dopamine that caused schizophrenia. But in fact, it's not, that people with schizophrenia have average levels of dopamine. But they have neurons that have too many receptors. In other words, if you remember talking about sensitivity, they have neurons that have a high degree of sensitivity to dopamine. It doesn't take much dopamine to make those dopaminergic neurons in the mesolimbic system in people with schizophrenia fire. So they have average amounts of dopamine, but the neurons that use dopamine in that limbic system are firing more frequently than we expect them to. And we get those positive symptoms as a result. We get a brain that's saying, I heard something, I saw something, I felt something, and so we get that excess of behavior there, right? Positive symptoms, too much of a behavior and that we wish wasn't there as much. Okay? The other place we get disruption to dopamine is in the prefrontal cortex, and this is related to negative symptoms. And remember, negative symptoms are that we don't have enough of something, that there's an absence of behaviors we wish were there. And think about the frontal lobe and how important it is to decision making and motivating us to behavior and making plans to engage in behavior, and all of that is kind of missing with a lot of those negative symptoms we talked about, and it's about a disruption of dopamine in that area of the brain. We also see serotonin and glutamate that seem to have some involvement, but not nearly in the ways that we look at dopamine as a way of understanding schizophrenia. If we look at brain structure and brain function, one of the most basic things that we've known for many decades is that on postmortem, at autopsy, we see that people with schizophrenia have enlarged ventricles. Those are the open spaces in the brain in several areas. And we're not sure whether it's the result of the illness, whether it's caused by the illness. Monozygotic twin studies seem to show that that might be the case, and that twins who don't have schizophrenia, the twin who doesn't have schizophrenia, does not seem to have the same enlargement of ventricles, and the fact that they increase over time also seems to indicate the same thing. We also see some disruptions in the temporal lobe, including the hippocampus, and the HPA axis with the long-term stress effects also seems to maybe not be functioning the ways we would expect it to. The temporal lobe is very connected to hallucinations in many different ways. In fact, when we have tumors in our temporal lobe, we sometimes will have hallucinations as a result. So it's not surprising that it seems important here as well. So let's think about the importance of the frontal lobe here for a second. We talked about this a little bit, the negative symptoms where we can't create complex behavior. So we talked about that. But the thing we haven't talked about is the age of onset of schizophrenia. And so I think we've mentioned this maybe other times in class, but schizophrenia typically first appears in late adolescence or early adulthood. It actually mimics the ages that we talked about with bipolar disorder pretty closely. And so I want you to think about the frontal lobe in terms of what's happening in late adolescence and early adulthood. And what's happening is the frontal lobe is maturing. It has its last steps of maturation in that time period. And so just as the frontal lobe is maturing is the time we also see the onset of a disorder that has, at least in part, its roots in disruptions of the frontal lobe. And so let's skip here for a second. It's also important to remember that while that final maturation is happening, there's also this final pruning process. So you might remember that as we enter into puberty, there's a pruning process where we get rid of connections, neural connections that we haven't been using. So you may not remember when you're 18 all of the Pokemon names you knew when you were 7. If you haven't thought about them since you were 7, your brain says we don't need this anymore. And there's some thought that that second pruning process that happens as the frontal lobe enters its last phase of maturation, that maybe something goes wrong there, that maybe there's too much pruning, maybe there's something that goes awry with that pruning process. So that's an interesting thing to think about. The other thing in terms of the developing brain is the idea of prenatal exposure to viruses. And I know this is a hard time for all of us to talk about viruses, so I'm going to be mindful of that. But we know from some of those Northern European countries that keep very good health records with their public health systems that in years, so cohorts of people, groups of people who were gestating, who were in their mom's uterus, right, during influenza outbreaks, those cohorts of people have higher rates, slightly higher rates of schizophrenia than other cohorts. And so we know that there's some link there. And the link seems to be that it may be that during prenatal development, the brain is susceptible to influence by viruses, and that sometimes what might get influenced is the likelihood of developing disruptions that we label as schizophrenia. So we're going to stop here, and then there'll be a second lecture on treatment.